We do have a target in front of us, about 50 meters dead ahead. Looks interesting on sonar.
A hard, solid return popped up on the sonar screen of the ship. The operator stared at the sharp edges and right angles on his monitor. Nature does not make shapes like this in the middle of a sand desert underwater. This was the target they were terrified to find. It was the heart of the shuttle, sitting 85 feet down. The disturbing signature suggested that the astronauts did not meet a quick end.
We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that we've only just begun. We're still pioneers. They, the members of the Challenger crew, were pioneers.
They were likely awake for the long fall back to Earth. This realization hit the crew harder than any wave ever could. Haunted sonar hits. The Atlantic Ocean is a massive and indifferent beast that swallows ships and secrets without leaving a single trace. In the winter of 1986, it had swallowed the pride of the American space program. We have grown used to the idea of space, but we often forget that we are still just pioneers. The members of the Challenger crew were pioneers in the truest sense of the word. They flew for 73 seconds before their world turned into a fireball. But what happened after that moment is the part they do not teach you in school. The search for the wreckage was the largest maritime salvage mission in history, and it was full of strange occurrences from the very start. The surface search was chaotic, with thousands of pounds of white debris floating on the waves for miles. But the real target was deep below. The Navy had deployed a fleet of ships, submarines, and research vessels to scan every inch of the ocean floor. The search grid was enormous and covered nearly 500 square miles of shifting sand and deep currents. It was like trying to find a specific car parked in a parking lot the size of a whole state, except the lights are off and the parking lot is underwater. For weeks, the sonar operators stared at their screens until their eyes burned. They were looking for any irregularity on the smooth bottom of the sea. Most of the time, it was nothing but junk like a sunken refrigerator or an old oil drum. The ocean is full of trash, and every false alarm drained the energy of the crew. But here's the catch. The waters off Cape Canaveral were not empty during this time. This was the height of the Cold War, and while the Americans were searching for their lost shuttle, the Soviets were watching closely. There were reports of Russian fishing ships sitting just outside the exclusion zone. These were not just fishermen, though. They were intelligence ships bristling with antennas and listening to every radio frequency. The paranoia was real. The Navy had to use its own resources just to keep an eye on the Russians. There was a genuine fear that if the Soviets got to the wreckage first, they could steal classified technology or plant false evidence. The divers were not just fighting the cold water, they were working in the shadow of a potential international incident. And that is putting it lightly. Then in early March, the rhythm of the search broke in a big way. The USS Preserver was running a sonar line in a sector that was marked as a low chance for a find. The operator on duty was watching the scrolling image of the seafloor built by sound waves. Suddenly, a signature appeared that made him sit up straight in his chair. It was not the jagged and scattered return of a debris field. Usually, when a craft hits the water at high speed, it shreds into tiny pieces of confetti. But this signal was different because it was a hard and solid return. It had sharp edges and clear geometry. Nature does not make right angles, and it definitely does not create large boxy structures in the middle of a sand plain. The operator called the bridge and told them to mark the spot. The ship circled back and ran the sonar over the spot again from a different angle. The image sharpened and showed a large object sitting heavily in the silt. It was partially covered, but unmistakably made by human hands. It was roughly 30 feet long, and the room went dead quiet. The dimensions did not match the wings or the tail. It did not match the cargo bay doors either. There was only one part of the shuttle that was that size and shape. The crew knew what it was before anyone said it out loud. It was the crew compartment. But there was something disturbing about the signature on the screen. it was way too intact. The shuttle had been torn apart by forces at 46,000 feet. Everyone had assumed the destruction was total. The popular belief was that the vehicle had been vaporized instantly. But the shadow on the screen told a different story. It suggested that a massive piece of the ship had survived the fire and the fall. And if the compartment was intact, that meant the astronauts might have been inside it when it hit the water. The mood on the ship shifted from a technical search to a somber and terrifying realization. The commander ordered the divers to suit up for the dive of their lives. This discovery meant the search for metal was now a mission to recover heroes from a watery grave. To really understand the horror of what the divers were about to find, we have to rewind the clock to that freezing morning. The official story is that a rubber seal failed because it was too cold outside. That is the version you find in the history books, but it is not that simple. Florida was experiencing a freak weather event where temperatures had plunged into the 20-degree range. The launch pad looked like an ice fortress with massive icicles hanging from the service structure. The real danger was inside the massive white solid rocket boosters, where the rubber rings had turned into hard plastic. They had lost their ability to flex and seal the joints. The company that built them knew this and begged NASA to delay the launch. But NASA was under immense pressure to prove that space travel was routine and punctual. They had a teacher on board and wanted her lesson to be seen by every school in the country. The managers told the engineers to stop acting like engineers and start acting like managers. The launch went ahead, and in less than a second, a puff of black smoke appeared. The seal had failed. For a minute, it looked like they might make it, but then the shuttle hit the strongest wind shear ever recorded. The vibration broke the temporary seal and a jet of flame escaped like a giant blowtorch. It burned through the tank and the bottom fell out. But here is what most people do not realize. It was not an explosion like a bomb. It was a structural breakup caused by the wind because the ship was flying sideways at twice the speed of sound. This is a crucial detail because it meant large pieces survived the breakup. The wings sheared off and the tail snapped, but the crew compartment was built to be the strongest part of the ship. It ripped away and began to fly free. At that moment, the 7 astronauts were still strapped into their seats. The cockpit was hurtling upward to a peak of 65,000 feet before gravity grabbed it. This is the part that keeps engineers awake at night. The survival of the cabin was a secret buried in the data for months. The video shows the nose section emerging from the fireball, mostly intact. So, when the divers were looking at that sonar signature, they were looking at a vessel that had flown for 2 minutes and 45 seconds after the breakup. The mystery was about the experience of that fall. Did they know what was happening? Were they awake? As the divers from the USS Preserver went deeper, the light faded into a bruising blue and then to total black. The depth was roughly 100 feet. It was deep enough to eliminate you if you made a single mistake. The currents were strong and tried to drag the divers away from their lines. The silt on the bottom was so fine that one wrong move would make visibility 0. When the lead diver finally hit the object with his light, he froze. The sonar had not lied to them. It was a massive structure sitting upright and banking to one side in the sand. The white tiles were scorched, but many were still there. The windows were the most haunting part of the find. The thick glass was still in place. Through the murky water, the divers could see into the flight deck. It was not empty. The report on the condition of what was inside is classified out of respect, but the cabin had held together. It had not been crushed like a soda can. It had been flattened by the impact of hitting the water at 200 miles per hour, but it was still a recognizable room. This discovery sent a shockwave through the whole team. Everyone had hoped that the end had been instant. Finding the cabin mostly whole meant that the forces in the air were not enough to end their lives. It meant the fall was the end. The divers had to work with extreme care because this was a grave and a crime scene. They documented every switch and every piece of gear. Rumors started to fly that the cabin was not where it should have been. Some thought the pilots had control for a few seconds, and tried to steer the massive brick through the air. The evidence waiting inside the control panels would soon tell a story of bravery in the face of certain doom. Last seconds of life. Once the salt water was cleaned off the instrument panels, the investigators realized something huge. 3 specific switches had been flipped on the panel. These were switches that could only be moved by a human hand after the shuttle had broken apart. This is the part of the story that was kept quiet for a long time. It fuels the anger and the cover-up theories to this day. When the cockpit was analyzed in the lab, they looked at the personal air packs. These are basically emergency scuba tanks that astronauts wear on their backs. To turn them on, you have to reach behind your head or have someone else do it for you. 4 of the packs were found, and 3 of them had been turned on. And get this, the pilot had his pack turned on, but it was in a spot he could not reach while strapped in. That means someone sitting behind him reached forward and turned his air on for him. This proves without a doubt that for several seconds after the breakup, the crew was alive and conscious. They were working the problem. They were not vaporized and they were not knocked out. They were trying to save the ship and each other. The wild theories go into overdrive here. Some people claim there is a secret tape of the cabin audio. The official record ends at the breakup, with the pilot saying a short phrase. But rumor says the recording kept going. The secret tape theory says there is audio of the crew talking during that long fall. NASA denies this and says the power was cut instantly. But people ask why the air packs were on if the crew was not awake and fighting. Let us look at the facts of the fall. The cabin separated at 46,000 feet and went up to 65,000 feet before it started to drop. The fall took 2 minutes and 45 seconds total. Try to imagine that for a moment. Sit and watch a clock for almost 3 minutes. If the cabin lost its air, they would have passed out in seconds. That would have been a mercy. But those air packs were on. If the cabin stayed pressurized, they were awake for the whole trip down. They would have seen the sky turn from black to blue. They would have heard the roar of the wind getting louder as they picked up speed. They would have felt the sickening weightlessness and then the crushing force of the spin. The disturbing signature the divers found was the forensic proof of this nightmare. The switches showed they had intent. The air packs showed they had a survival instinct. There is another theory that the commander tried to use a system that had been removed from the shuttle years before. The tragedy is that they were flying a metal box with no way out. When the public found out about the air packs years later, it caused a massive firestorm. People felt like they had been lied to by the government. NASA allowed the instant death story to stand because it was less painful for the families. But knowing they fought until the end makes the negligence of the launch day feel much worse. The pilot had moved several switches to try and restore power. He was fighting until the very last second. This turned the disaster into a story of ultimate heroism. They did not panic. They did their jobs while the sky was falling around them. They were astronauts until the very end. Some people on the internet claim they were alive after they hit the water, but that is not true. The impact at 200 miles per hour created 200 units of force. It was fatal instantly. The structure was crushed in a way that made surviving the hit impossible. The question of what could have been done to save them would haunt the space program for decades to come. Cold reality of space. Even decades later, the Challenger story remains shrouded in a cloud of wild theories and dark myths. When a tragedy of this magnitude occurs on the world stage, the human brain often refuses to accept a simple mechanical explanation. We are programmed to look for patterns, to find intent where there is only error, and to seek out a complex plot with a clear villain. To accept that 7 lives were lost because of a piece of rubber and a cold morning feels too small, too senseless. And so, the vacuum of grief is filled with shadows. To understand the most persistent theories, one must remember the atmosphere of the mid-80s. The United States and the USSR were locked in a silent, high-stakes race to militarize the heavens. This wasn't just about moon rocks anymore. It was about the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars. The Shuttle program was the backbone of this defense strategy, designed to lift heavy, sophisticated laser satellites into orbit that could, in theory, intercept Soviet missiles. If the Shuttle program failed, the entire American defense umbrella crumbled. This context gave birth to the Soviet sabotage theory. Some theorists point to the presence of Soviet fishing trawlers, heavily instrumented intelligence ships, that were spotted off the coast of Florida in the days surrounding the launch. They whisper of land-based Soviet lasers heating the external tank, or a sleeper agent tampering with the solid rocket boosters on the launch pad. While there is zero evidence to support a hostile act, the mere presence of those Russian ships in the Atlantic keeps the theory alive in the darker corners of the internet. It is easier for some to believe in a sophisticated act of war than in a management failure. Perhaps the most haunting and disrespectful conspiracy is the claim that the astronauts are still alive. This theory relies on the discovery of lookalikes, people with the same names and similar facial features working as professors, lawyers, or accountants across the country. One popular claim points to a man in South Carolina who bears a striking resemblance to Commander Dick Scobie. This brand of conspiracy is a classic psychological defense mechanism known as denial on a grand scale. It gets millions of clicks because people love a mystery where nobody actually dies, but it is deeply painful for the families who spent years grieving very real losses. These sightings have been debunked repeatedly. The ages don't match, the backgrounds are different, and the physics of the crew cabin's impact with the ocean makes survival an impossibility. Yet, the myth persists because the human heart wants to believe that heroes don't really leave us. Then, there are the fans of the extraterrestrial. If you watch the grainy tracking footage of the disaster, some frames appear to show a small, white dot moving rapidly past the shuttle just seconds before the breakup. Alien enthusiasts claim this was a UAP, or a craft that attacked the shuttle to prevent humanity from weaponizing space. In reality, the sky that morning was filled with debris. When a vehicle is under the immense stress that the Challenger was experiencing, it sheds layers of ice, venting gases, and small pieces of insulation. At those speeds and distances, a simple shard of ice, reflecting the sun, can look like a maneuverable craft. But for those who want to see a message from the stars, a piece of ice is never just a piece of ice. The real conspiracy, pride, and paperwork. The irony of these wild theories is that there was a conspiracy, but it wasn't about aliens or spies. It was a conspiracy of silence and bureaucratic pressure. It took place in a room full of men in suits, staring at a chart that clearly showed the O-rings would fail in freezing temperatures. Engineers at Morton Thiokol had begged their managers to postpone the launch. They knew the rubber seals would become brittle like glass in the record-breaking Florida. Cold. But the people in charge were worried about optics. They had already delayed the launch several times. President Reagan was set to give the State of the Union address that night, and he wanted to mention the Teacher in Space program. The real villain wasn't a Soviet laser. It was a management team that told its engineers to take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat. They launched because they didn't want to look bad on national television. The disturbing signature that divers eventually found on the ocean floor was the direct result of a meeting where safety was sacrificed for the sake of a schedule. The divers who touched the wreckage of the Challenger know the truth better than any theorist. When they descended into the dark, murky waters of the Atlantic, they weren't looking for laser marks or evidence of a struggle. They were searching for the remains of a machine that had been betrayed by the people who built it. Working in the freezing currents, surrounded by shifting silt, these divers saw the reality of physics. They saw how the crew cabin had remained largely intact until it hit the water at over 200 miles per hour. They saw the strength of the human spirit in the way the astronauts had activated their emergency air packs, a sign that they were alive and fighting until the very end. The legacy of those dives changed the world of oceanography forever. The sonar techniques and deep-sea recovery protocols developed to find the Challenger were the same tools used just a year later to locate the wreck of the Titanic. The technology born from this tragedy allowed us to explore the deepest parts of our own planet, even as our reach for the stars was temporarily halted. Today, the pieces of the Challenger are not in a museum. They are buried in two abandoned missile silos, Complex 31 and 32, at Cape Canaveral. They were lowered into the earth and sealed under tons of concrete. NASA treats the site with the same reverence as a tomb, ensuring that the wreckage can never be used for profit or morbid curiosity. What do you think is the most mysterious part of this whole recovery mission? Do you believe the official story about the Russian ships? Let me know what you think in the comments. Please like and subscribe for more.